Tales of Estolia. Volume 1. The Promise of Zaccarias. Part 4. Heritage. Chapter 1. World Religions. Fresco University, Tuscaloosa, Alabama. 1989. With 86 generations of capítulos and ensayos, I believed there would be nothing new to write about for the modern generation. Then the heir apparent and the last resort abdicated, and it was clear in all things deity is as close to us now, and as necessary, as during the time of Zaccarias and Estoliana. Balthazar Leopold Zaccarian, Capítulo 87. Lillian leaned back against the cement column. This was her favorite place to study. She could watch the other university students without having to mingle. Her years with Randolph did not make mingling easy. As always, thinking about him made her restless. She snapped her books shut. She had an appointment with her faculty advisor. She packed her school bag and walked briskly towards the building, doing her best to shed the memories that threatened to swamp her. She knocked on Dr. Long's office door and entered at his invitation. She liked him. He had a way of lecturing that caught the students' attention and laughed as often at himself as at others. "Thank you, Taryn, for coming to see me." Every time she heard the name Taryn, she had to control a desire to shudder in distaste. She was not given a choice regarding her name. Her last name, Lillian, was more palatable, but before she could remind Dr. Long to use it, the courtyard clock started to chime. Everyone at Fresco University stopped speaking when the clock struck the hour. Authorities several counties away would call the university if the clock stopped for any reason. One of her professors had even speculated that it was the loudest university clock in the United States. "I wanted to meet with you to discuss your course schedule," he said after the loud echoes finally faded. "One of the requirements, here at Fresco University, is that you must take one of our explorations courses. I'd like to encourage you to take Exploration of World Religions. It really is one of our best courses, and the professor who teaches it will be retiring at the end of next semester. You could take it and get it out of the way." Fresco University built their reputation on the explorations classes. Every professor of the small private liberal arts college was required to develop and present one explorations course per year. They were as variable as the instructors. Some were better than others. They discussed her classes and, at the end of the meeting, Dr. Long signed off on the change to her schedule. She was blessed to be given the chance to discover herself here in this tiny private university. She had trouble locating the class and had to pause just outside the classroom door to catch her breath. The door was slightly ajar. She could hear the professor speaking. When he paused, she slipped in and slid into a vacant chair at the back of the room. "Over the 4 months of this course, each of you will select a different unique religion to explore. We will meet once a week to discuss the different characteristics of world religions to guide you. The purpose behind the explorations classes is to help you become lifelong independent learners, willing and able to explore whatever topic grabs your interest throughout your lives. During this course you will explore the religion assigned to you. I will make the time to meet privately with each of you every other week." Lillian looked at the list of esoteric religions. She had only heard of one of them, and that one had already been selected. The 10th religion, Estolian, was penciled in at the bottom of the typewritten list and was the only one not yet selected. She wrote her name next to it. The professor gave them tips on how to proceed in their explorations as well as some information on what their finished term project would be like. After the class let out, Dr. Lestold asked her to remain behind. "Do you mind walking with me back to my office?" he asked her. "We can speak while we are walking." They walked slowly across the small campus. Dr. Lestold asking her how she was settling into the university and what she thought of her first term. Once they were in the spacious office, he set his books down and gestured for her to have a seat. "Tell me a little bit about yourself, my dear," he encouraged her. "I grew up in a very remote area of Alaska," she told him her cover story, still uncomfortable with lying. "Because we were so far from others, My mother homeschooled me. I finished my graduation requirements and applied to several universities. My father thought a small college would be best for me, so when I was offered a scholarship here at Fresco, he wanted me to accept it. Do you have brothers and sisters? She thought of her brothers and sisters, but shook her head. According to her cover story, she was an only child. My parents didn't expect to have any children. They were in their early 50s when my birth parents were killed in an airplane crash near their place. They took me in and raised me. I didn't have any other relatives. Did you go home and visit your parents during the recent holidays? She shook her head. Truthfully, she related the demise of the couple who were part of her cover story. Once I left for school, my parents decided to take a trip of a lifetime. They planned to do it earlier, but when I came along, they postponed their trip nearly 15 years for my sake. After a pause, she said, they were on the Gambian Queen. The notorious ship had capsized, with nearly 2/3 of the passengers killed in the disaster. They would have been happy to go together, and to know they died only after they saw me situated in life. The one time she met the elderly couple, she liked them, and she had to blink back tears at the thought of the tragedies. I'm very sorry to hear of your loss, he said solemnly. If I or anyone else on the faculty can help you in any way, you must share with us your needs. Thank you. She shared. Strangely, I felt more peace than grief. They lived a long and fulfilling life, and accomplished their life goals. I was in college, they were together, it was a blessing for them and just exactly what they wanted out of the end of their lives, no loose ends, the chance to go together. He was silent for several moments, perhaps in tribute to her parents, and the loss she was reliving. I wanted to speak to you about your assignment. Normally I only have 9 students in the class, but Dr. Long asked me to take on one further student. I agreed, but whenever I do take on a larger class than expected, I give Estolia as the religion to investigate. That is why I asked you to come to my office. Estolia is perhaps the hardest assigned religion because there is very little about it available in reference books. I happen to know a couple of individuals who are Estolian, and I wanted you to know that I will arrange for you to meet with one or both if you wish. I think you will find it an interesting religion to study, especially as every citizen of the little-known country of Estolia is also a member of the faith. Chapter 2. Lifetime of Regret. From the very first days of Estolia, men and women were drawn to the nation. Whether influenced by deity, or brought here by chance, those individuals who found a resonance within their soul discovered they were truly home for the first time in their lives. So it was true in the beginning, so is it true now. 11th postulate of inner peace, Kedaro. Once the office door closed behind the red-haired student, Eduardo leaned back in his office chair, coughing occasionally, but his thoughts weren't on the discomfort of his lungs. He was thinking instead about Anastasia. It was 1954 when he received the letter. It was remarkable from the moment he took his mail out of his box at the university. The envelope was not quite the standard size and was made from a thick, almost corrugated stationery that was a faint green with occasional fibers of slightly darker green and occasional purple overtones. The ink itself was a deep purple. It was handwritten on stationery that matched the envelope.
Dr. Eduardo Lestalt, Collins University. On the advice of a mutual friend, Nathaniel Montclair, I send you this correspondence to inquire if you would be interested in writing the history of my nation, Estolia. In this modern era of transcontinental flights, telegrams, and overseas telephone calls, it has become vital that we proactively seek to share some of the details of our nation and our faith with those who are curious. I was fascinated to read your paper entitled Anoxes, Palmyra, and Cella, a unique trio of interdependent shipping ports in the ancient world. We here in Estolia feel as if you will be generous in your treatment of our nation. You would be able to visit Estolia as our guest during your summer vacation to gather whatever information you require. With the brevity of your summer vacation, we would fly you out to Estolia at our expense to give you the maximum amount of time spent gathering information. All your travel, lodging, and other expenses would be part of your remuneration. If possible, please respond by return mail. Your most humble and obedient servant, Xavier Archimedes Zaccarian, Keeper of the Soul of Estolia.
Having only just obtained his tenured position at Collins University, it was critical to publish. As a professor of history, with an emphasis on religions, he was fascinated by some of the smaller countries that were, to a greater or lesser degree, theocracies. It sounded like this nation might be one of them. It took 4 days to get to Estolia. Eduardo took a taxi to the Tuscaloosa airport. That was the first time he saw the sleek new airplane that belonged to the nation of Estolia. From Tuscaloosa, they flew to New York. Eduardo felt better and better about the job he'd been asked to take on. He enjoyed the way he was treated as if he was important. He and the flight crew all got a decent night's sleep in New York before the long flight over the Atlantic the next day. They would stop to refuel in Greenland and continue to London. The flight would take nearly 8 hours, and they would leave at 7 in the morning and arrive after sunset. It was dark when they landed in London. "We will remain here all of tomorrow," the stewardess said to him. "This will allow you to get used to the change in time zones. We will leave quite early the next day and arrive in the morning." He boarded the now familiar green and purple airplane in the early hours of the morning on the final day of his trip. They would arrive with the dawn, he was told. He felt the tingle of excitement when the engines on the airplane changed their tone. Before this trip he did not have the luxury of flying. But he now felt like an expert. When the visit concluded, he planned to ask if it was possible for him to have a longer layover in London. He would never get the chance to visit London again. When the doors of the airplane were opened, he paused to look around. Beauty was his first impression. He soaked up his surroundings while he slowly descended the stairs. To one side was a carriage with reddish-brown horses. Several individuals were approaching the airplane. The man on the right wore elaborate robes like those worn by monks, and he was in a wheelchair. A man in dark attire was pushing the wheelchair. Eduardo was almost to the bottom of the stairs when he turned his attention to the woman walking alongside the man in the wheelchair. She looked like the fiery red accents within a particularly fine opal. He was so focused on her extraordinary appearance that he misjudged his step and promptly fell down the stairs, hitting the tarmac with a sickening snap. The man in the wheelchair arrived swiftly, saying in English, "Are you injured?" Eduardo grimaced as the pain was ratcheted up with every breath he took. "I think I twisted my ankle," he said through clenched teeth. He was embarrassed to fall in front of these two, in particular the walking beacon of opalescent brilliance, and tried unsuccessfully to get to his feet. His leg was broken. Chapter 3. A Broken Leg. As the oldest son of the keeper, I attended the training given to the king's second son. There was always a chance that something might happen, and I might be asked to take on the soul of Estolia. In that unlikely scenario, I would be prepared by this extra instruction. My prayers were fervent that I might never have to utilize any of the things that I learned. I could not understand why any Estolian would be envious of king or keeper. My father's devotion to Estolia, and the time he spent in his role as keeper was more than I could personally sacrifice. I did not wish to face long hours apart from my Kali. Antiochus Cadarin Zaccarian, inscrito. The man in the wheelchair turned and said something to the woman in their native language. She responded in the same language, and then dashed across to a saddled horse with a blood-red coat. She mounted and then galloped away, the hooves of her mount striking sparks from the tarmac. "Are you injured anywhere else?" he asked. "No, I think it is just the leg." "You are in luck then, we have one of the best orthopedic surgeons in Europe right here in Estolia. He will be here as fast as possible." "I didn't mean to cause all this fuss," Eduardo said. The stewardesses had brought him multiple pillows from the airplane, and he was leaning back against the stairs, as comfortable as possible in the circumstances. "I should have introduced myself. My name is Xavier Archimedes Zaccarian. I am the keeper of the soul of Estolia, last resort and first consul to the king. Dr. Eduardo Lestalt." Xavier leaned forward, beginning to extend a hand, but just then the petite dynamo, shining like a crystal palace, came galloping back. Eduardo watched her dismount, fascinated by the way she moved, the way she seemed to be a kaleidoscope of colors in motion. Parker saw the accident from the control tower. She gestured to the only building in sight. He phoned the palace, and they phoned the temple. Uncle Max had already decided to come down, to meet the historian. He brought the large carriage. "He will be here in less than 15 minutes. She kept glancing at Eduardo. Almost reluctantly, Xavier said, "Anastasia, this is Dr. Eduardo Lestalt. He is here to write the history of Estolia. Dr. Lestalt, my daughter Anastasia." She extended her hand to him, and when clasped it, he felt a thrill of sensation rush up his arm. It was only when Xavier cleared his throat that Eduardo realized he was still holding her hand. He released it and then looked at his hand, wondering how so much warmth and peace could be generated by the touch of one hand. After an awkward silence, he said, "I feel foolish. I've never broken anything in my life. I just wasn't prepared for the glare." Eduardo barely felt the prick of the needle. Whatever the doctor gave him was swift. At Fresco University, the sister university to Collins, one of the psychology professors had taught a seminar to the other instructors about something she called mindfulness. A way of thinking about the sensory input that the brain was provided, and categorizing it as simple stimuli rather than something to be acted upon. He could hear her peculiarly deep speaking voice telling the attendees, pain is the one stimulus that is hard to discount. But, like sight, you can tune the sensation out, not allow it access. The result of this exercise can be, if you are open to it, the most liberating experience of your life. He recalled the lesson, where first the lecturer and then a volunteer allowed several fire ants to bite them. While the carriage set off for some destination that seemed wholly irrelevant, he visualized the pain as an amorphous entity throbbing with reds and blacks, and the medicine the doctor gave him as the fluffy white of cotton. The pain, he imagined, was concentrated in a caricature of his psyche, a small representation of self that approached the cotton wool summer clouds and climbed onto them, lying down and sinking into blissful sleep. At the same time as the figment of his imagination drifted to sleep, the pain, anchored to the figment, was swept away into a dreamland of health and wholesomeness. As he watched the figment sleeping, the occasional tentacle of pain would ripple under the surface of the cotton wool bed, but it remained muted by the medicine and by Eduardo's control over pain as taught in that long-ago symposium. As he focused on the imagery, painting as many intricate details as possible, he could feel the tension melting out of his shoulders. He must have either passed out or drifted to sleep, because the next thing he knew, a hand on his shoulder was waking him. They were at an impressive entrance into some sort of structure built into the mountain itself. Immense feline statues stared down at him, as if he was not quite worthy to enter their temple. He looked up into their emerald eyes and begged them to allow him to enter, thanking them when they relaxed their guard, allowing him to enter and find solace for the injuries to his body. 20 minutes later, the doctor returned. He placed an X-ray on a light panel just as the door opened and Xavier and his daughter Anastasia came into the room. Xavier asked, "Do you mind if we are here while my brother explains your prognosis?" Whatever was in the injection given to him, Eduardo was grateful for it, and for the fact that it was still working. He looked at the doctor and the man in the wheelchair and asked, "Are you twins, or just brothers?" Xavier responded, "Twins." He wheeled slightly closer and said, "Which reminds me, I have not formally introduced you to." He turned to the doctor with a grin before looking back at Eduardo. "Eduardo, this is my brother, Maximiliano Sebastian Zaccarian, Duke, Sovereign, and King of Estolia. Max, this is Dr. Eduardo Lestalt. It is a very great pleasure to meet you, Dr. Lestalt. Please call me Max." He stuck a hand out for Eduardo to shake. "Thanks, please call me Eduardo." He was dazed at the introduction. "King? I thought you were an orthopedic surgeon. How badly is his leg broken?" Anastasia interrupted their introductions to demand imperatively. The doctor responded to both questions. "I studied orthopedics in London, and practiced there for several years before it was time for me to take on my hereditary role. I do not often get the chance to practice my craft." He glanced at Anastasia for just a moment before he gestured towards the X-ray of Eduardo's leg. "You have a simple fracture of the fibula. It should heal without any sort of surgery. With luck, in 6 weeks you will be able to start walking, and within 3 months, you will have trouble remembering which leg you actually broke." Chapter 4. Law of Destiny. In my final year of education prior to going to college, our instructor asked us one day to come up with a suitable research project. At the time I had recently switched my attention from one hobby to another, so I decided to research whether the various kings had hobbies, too. I didn't expect it to be approved, as it was a last-minute selection totally arbitrary. The look of amusement on Cousin Mark's face should have given me a clue why he accepted it. I became fascinated by the numerous and varied hobbies that occupied the attention of the different kings. Somehow I expected most of them to be content with just being king. Zaccarian was crazy about dyes, and Alexandros started the selective breeding of the spotted, multi-horned island goats. The more research I did, the more I discovered. Some kings studied the Estolian butterflies, others the bees. Quaidaro studied our native hairy bats. I even made up a poem to begin my presentation in front of the class. Our kings were fond of many things: goats and trees, butterflies and bees, hairy bats, and dye in vats. Serenity Barlow Zaccarian, inscrito. Max, with the help of one of his assistants, applied a temporary splint. Xavier asked Eduardo, "Do you know why you fell?" "It was the glare," he said truthfully. "It was just so unexpected, so beautiful, I lost track of where I was on the stairs and fell." He flushed again at the memory. Xavier maneuvered himself closer, and when he spoke, his voice was rough and he was looking at Eduardo with a strange expression on his face. "When is your 30th birthday?" Eduardo was aware that he looked old for his age. His hair began receding when he was 18, and in recent years he had put on a roll of fat around his waist. He was a bit stooped. The last time anyone accurately guessed his age was when he was 12. By the time he was 14, he looked old enough to vote. The two men were looking at him strangely. He'd lapsed into memories without answering the question. "Sorry. My birthday is August 14th. "We will remove the cast the week before your birthday," Max said. Despite the excellent pain medicine available, and the apparent simplicity of the break, the following week was one of the worst in his life. Originally, he was to have occupied one of the tower guest suites, but once it was clear he would not be climbing stairs, and would need frequent help, he was given a luxurious set of rooms in the keeper's wing of the palace. After the first week, the worst of the pain was over. He could get around easily with crutches. Once he was mobile, he was directed to the lounge that held the one elevator in the palace. Xavier accompanied him and said, "I was thinking this would be the perfect place for you to do your work. It provides you with access to all the levels, and there are all manner of reference books. It is, you might say, the Royal Library. It was a delightful space. The central shaft was both the elevator and small two-level apartments. Between the shaft and the outer walls were broad landings at each level, with stairs stretching between inner and outer walls. The walls were lined with books. In essence, the result was a flight of stairs, and the attendant library lining the walls, that climbed a vertical distance well in excess of 200 feet. It was the equivalent of a 20-story building. As an historian, his broken leg did not interfere with his work. Once he established his workspace, he was able to dig into the information provided for him. 2 days after he began to work on his task, Xavier joined him. "My daughter has requested that she be allowed to assist you. Has she talked about this with you?" Anastasia stopped in to see him frequently. Each time she surprised him, the opalescent radiance that danced around her fascinated him. He didn't know if she would, in the end, be more of a hindrance than help. But his broken leg did slow him down. "I welcome the help. I have asked Jamal Taylor, who has recently finished his acolyte year, to be available to you as well." On his first day working in the library, Jamal had approached him to ask if he could help. Roughly 1/3 of Estolians had darker features, and Jamal sported very dark skin, darker than most. His eyes were equally dark, and he had a lively personality and would make a phenomenal historian. He smiled in pleasure at the thought of the young man assisting him. "I've met him, he has a fine mind and a passion for historical accuracy. I was very impressed with him." Eduardo studied Xavier's grim expression and asked, "What exactly did you want to tell me?" "My daughter is infatuated with you. I believe that you return the attraction. I utterly forbid you to kiss her. You must promise, moreover, to never be alone with her. Jamal has offered to move into the room next to yours, so that he can help you in all ways." "And act as a chaperone," Eduardo said. "Fine." He had never had a father warn him off before. "Your word?" Xavier insisted. There were nuances to the conversation that were intriguing. However, he had to put Xavier's mind at rest before he asked the half-dozen questions clamoring within him. "I promise that I will neither kiss nor be alone with your daughter, Anastasia." Xavier's eyes searched his, and he said finally, "Our belief system is quite different from many you may have studied over the years. To us, a woman's purity before finding the one man with whom she will spend eternity is utterly critical. To take a woman's purity casually is to effectively ruin her chance to marry and obtain all of the glorious blessings promised to our founder Zaccarias, and to his descendants until time itself ceases to be time." Xavier needed to be able to trust him to work with Anastasia without breaking his promise. Searching for the right words, he said, "I have always been fascinated by the role of faith and religion as applied to love, marriage, and the afterlife. I may not be Estolian, but I will treasure and value your beliefs, and your daughter, as if I was born here. She is safe with me." Most of the time he was working with Jamal and Anastasia, Eduardo was able to forget how attractive she was. From time to time, however, he would send Jamal to fetch a book from another level of the library or to look something up, and he would realize that he'd been staring at her, and the ghost of an echo of the lively inner life of a fire opal surrounding her, as ephemeral as the after-image one got after accidentally glancing directly at the sun. Chapter 5. Dawn Tradition. Living in Estolia brought Key enormous satisfaction. Not only was his opinion valued, but his skill with shaping rock was uncanny. He was given the freedom to exercise his talent in whatever way he wished. He was a solemn, serious-seeming man, but sometimes he would demonstrate the light heart that dwelt within him. He spent one afternoon on an outcrop of rock at the base of Mount Estoliana. When he finished, it was impossible to see what he had done from up close. But from a distance, the whimsy was obvious. The arm of Mount Estoliana, curved round the lesser peak, now had a well-proportioned lion's paw at its end. Kytheros, Capitulo 42. A week before his birthday the cast came off. His leg was healing remarkably fast. After his first few tentative steps, he was relieved at how easy it was to walk. While atypical, one can break their ankle with minimal soft tissue damage. It appears this is what happened in your case. Looking refined, the doctor wore his crown, elegant cape, and accoutrements of his station that set him apart as king. Why did you take your crown and cape off when I first met you? Having just suffered a broken bone, I thought you might have misgivings if I looked like a king and not a doctor. It was better to appear casual and underdressed than overdressed. Perhaps you have a point. A tap on the door preceded it opening, in the typical Estolian fashion. Anastasia burst into the room, like a tornado. She came to a halt when she saw her uncle looking at his leg, and the remnants of the cast laying like confetti around them. I had hoped to be here before you took the cast off. She sounded disappointed. Anastasia, you do understand that Eduardo has the right to privacy? Of course, she said in that blithe way she had of ignoring facts she didn't like. How is it? She asked. They both turned to look up at Eduardo. It's only a little tender, a little weak. Excellent, she said with relish. Can you ride? Eduardo remembered the interminable lessons he had as a teenager, his aunt insisting that he had to learn to ride, as if it was one of the most critical skills of the 20th century. Reluctantly he admitted, I know the basics. But I don't know that I'd do very well if I had a spirited mount. The door opened again. It was Xavier. Father. She launched herself across the room to give her father a heartfelt hug. One of the things that had often occupied his imagination was the way she approached everything with so much passion and life. He could not help but think of how it would be if he had her in his bed, willing, centering all that glorious tempestuous nature on him. 2 days before his birthday, during dessert, she said, I have asked the stable master if there is a horse you could ride who would not be as spirited as Sirocco. Where are you planning to ride? Xavier asked, glancing from Eduardo to his daughter. She beamed a broad smile at her father before answering. I think that Eduardo should see the dawn from Mount Estoliana. The stable master has the perfect mount for him. The heavy frown on Xavier's face reminded Eduardo of his promise to never be alone with Anastasia. I hope I shall be allowed to go with you, Jamal's smooth voice interjected. I have just finished writing some music for my piccolo to go with a poem called The Dawn. I do not know which ancestor wrote the poem, but it is very beautiful. Eduardo watched the strain on Xavier's face drain away, slightly. Something that was disturbing him. Rather than an objection or an attempt to discourage Anastasia, he merely said, I have heard that the forecast for tomorrow is supposed to be quite pleasant. Eduardo did not consider himself a morning person before his visit to Estolia. But the keeper and his family all woke early and full of energy. In the 7 weeks he'd been living with them, he'd come to appreciate the beauty of the morning. That did not, however, prepare him for the need to wake up more than an hour before dawn. He had trouble stifling the multiple yawns that punctuated the ride to the top of the mountain. After his third loud yawn, he could hear Anastasia laughing. Sorry, he mumbled. I'm just not used to getting up this early. They continued to chat during the ride. The sound of her quicksilver voice thrumming through the pre-dawn air set up an answering vibration through his system, as if he was a violin, and she was the musician calling forth beauty from within him. By the time they reached the peak, he could not recall any of the topics they discussed during the ride. Just being with Anastasia had that effect on him. When she reined to a halt, he looked around curiously. They had reached an area on the top of the lesser peak that was a flat irregular crescent wrapping around the jutting rocks of the summit. The trail, considerably narrower, continued. He couldn't make out many of the details in the featureless pre-dawn. I would like to ride to the very top to watch the sunrise and play my piccolo, Jamal said. With a carefree wave towards them, he urged his mount to tackle the narrower passage. Chapter 6. Tempestuous. I took my acolyte year after getting my degree in animal husbandry. When the keeper suggested to me, during my exit interview at the end of the acolyte year, that I spend a year in service, I did not object. I had no doubts that it was inspiration that sent me to El Paso. This gave me the chance to understand other cultures in a way that my college. The 4 years I spent in New Zealand were an idyllic pastoral time. But I saw want and need from a new light once I worked serving the poor in Texas. As an Estolian, my needs are always met, making it difficult to grasp what a person might do to secure food for his family, or medicine for a sick child. Seeing poverty, really seeing it, changed the man I was, and the man I would end up being. Working with the poor changed my trajectory in life irrevocably. I moved to Hallows End and worked with a small team of like-minded individuals to combat poverty and hunger. We worked to find a solution to the biggest shortage on our beleaguered planet, a shortage of hope. Carlyle Beaverton, Inscrito. Once they were alone, they dismounted. He winced slightly when his leg gave a twinge. Anastasia led him to a series of boulders that were the perfect size and location for watching the sunrise. Once they were seated, Anastasia leaned against him. The feel of her soft flesh against his, the tingle of her magical touch, tested his endurance. Eduardo had given his word to Xavier that he would not kiss her. Additionally, he was inhibited by the presence of Jamal. While he wasn't visible to them, he was playing his piccolo, an intricate tune reverberating off the side of the greater peak of Mount Estoliana. They sat in silence, watching the glorious sunset fading to streaky pastels, painted boldly across the canvas of the morning sky. Anastasia was tucked up against his side, and Eduardo was immersed in the fantasy that they were newlyweds, that they would soon return to their home, together. "Has my father talked with you about our faith yet?" "A little," he said. "Mostly we've been discussing the impact of major historical events on Estolia. I think it's fascinating." He broke off what he was saying. She didn't want to speak about history. Estolian men marry when they are 30. His 30th birthday was the next day. He didn't know what to say to her. "Eduardo?" She looked at him, the rosy flush on her cheeks, and the glistening reflection of the rising sun off her lower lip were tempting him. He didn't just want to kiss her, he wanted to feel the warmth of her body taking him in, becoming one with him. To keep from breaking his word, he crushed her close in an embrace, his lips on her hair. Surely this was not violating the spirit of his promise? "Are you really 30 tomorrow?" The sweet trill of Jamal's piccolo soaring in a complex crescendo swirled around them, providing him with a much-needed anchor. "Yes, Anastasia. Do you know why I glowed when you met me?" "You still do." She scooted even closer to him, slipping her right arm around his waist. "You see my aura," she told him. While she spoke, the sun breasted the shoulder of Mount Zaccarias, and for just a second the palace itself seemed to have the same beautiful glow as Anastasia. After the almost intolerable beauty of the sunrise, he was reluctant to speak. What does it mean? He didn't really want to ask. They were effectively alone, with Jamal out of sight, the first time they'd ever been alone. He wanted to touch her chin, tilt her head upward so she'd be at the perfect height for him to kiss her, and after that. He was grateful when she answered his question. The erotic turn to his thoughts made thinking difficult. And he had promised her father he would not kiss her. "You see my soul, Eduardo." He laughed. He couldn't help it. "It's impossible to see someone's soul," he refuted. His laughter made her recoil, and her eyes looking into his were reproachful. "Here in Estolia, you can see someone's soul," she insisted. "So? What's the significance?" He felt as if everything he said left him blundering further and further. He cursed the lack of knowledge of her belief systems so that he might temper his reactions to what she expected. "Deity knows we are perfect for each other." He was always fascinated by religion, and since his arrival he'd spent a lot of time with acolytes, elders, and Xavier, asking questions and trying to come to understand their faith, but he was, by nature, a cautious man. He wanted Anastasia with a level of near desperation. But he didn't jump into relationships or assumptions. "Deity wishes for you to give me your soul," she continued on. He stood up abruptly, wincing as his newly healed leg gave him a twinge of pain. He walked over to his beige mount and then turned to look at Anastasia. She was on her feet, looking at him in alarm. "You do not want me, do you?" she asked. Her voice was full of anguish. "No." He didn't get the chance to finish his sentence, to tell her it had nothing to do with wanting her, because he did, but everything to do with not leaping blind into any situation. He needed to explore the concept before he could do anything. As soon as she heard the negation, she was on her feet. "You do not want me." Before he could call her back, she was jumping on her horse and clattering down the trail to the base of the mountain. Eduardo felt as if he had committed some crime. Jamal, having heard her departure, joined him. He looked around and then guessed she tried to explain the Estolian way. Disturbed, confused, Eduardo said, "I think so." He took a deep breath and said, "She misinterpreted something I said to her." He thought about her volatile temperament and the way she rushed down the trail. "But I do think I need to explain the misunderstanding as soon, and as fast, as possible." Jamal looked like he was weighing Eduardo up. When he spoke next, he had a tone of urgency to his voice. "I think you are right, we must seek her out. We will follow her to the temple. My guess is that she will seek out her father, the keeper." While they rode, Jamal pointed out several landmarks that had been invisible in the pre-dawn darkness of their ride to the pinnacle. He was annoyed at first, thinking it was pointless to slow down to look at the elbow of Mount Hestoliana, or the top of the lion's paw, a stone formation that had looked roughly like an enormous lion's paw in its natural state, but which Chi had further shaped with only a couple of hours of work. At the speed of Anastasia's departure, he feared that a single misstep by her horse could be fatal. He was consumed by an irrational fear that he would somehow lose her before he could explain what he'd meant. When they reached the valley floor, he could see an acolyte leading Anastasia's blood-red horse towards the steps of the temple entrance. Eduardo felt immense relief to see her alive and well. She was speaking with her father, in his wheelchair, just outside the grand double doors. As volatile as ever, she said something strident to her father and flew down the stairs to fling herself in the saddle. The horse, startled perhaps by her precipitate actions, took a step backwards at the same moment that Eduardo called out to her. She was looking at him, her attention not on her horse, when it backed into the stone steps and spooked, leaping forward unexpectedly, unseating her. The cracking sound of bones breaking, when she landed on the steps of the temple, was much louder than the sound of his ankle breaking when he fell down the airstairs. But, having heard the sound of breaking bones once, he would never forget it. Her father was out of his wheelchair and on the stone steps where she came to rest, holding her, his bellow of agony ripping through Eduardo's gut as he saw the truth on Xavier's face. He was about to spur Sedona into a fast gallop when he saw one of the ubiquitous carriages come to a halt, and her mother climbed out, exclaiming in horror and joining her husband on the steps, cradling Anastasia in their arms. He halted and stared at the tableau in front of him. Nothing would ever be right in his world again. The clock tower chimed, bringing him back to his office in Alabama. 1989. Away from the pain of his memories. It was almost time for the final class of the day. While he gathered his papers, he reflected on how that summer ended. He couldn't write the history of Estolia. He gave his research notes to Xavier. Jamal or someone else would write it. All he wanted was to go home and forget he ever came to Estolia. He couldn't forget Anastasia. She was with him at night, in his dreams. He clung to the message Xavier passed on, her final words, for him, that she would wait for him in their horizon. He could only hope it was true. His future had stretched before him like a barren, pointless wasteland as he flew back to his home in Alabama. Over the years, equilibrium helped him to go on, alone. When a teaching position opened at Fresco University, with radical views and revolutionary ways of teaching, he left Collins. Since then, he spent the years touching students' lives, sharing his knowledge of world religions, and waiting for that time he would move on to Horizon, to Anastasia's waiting arms. Chapter 7. Frustration.
The leaders of repressive nations control the information available to their citizens. Estolia has sought, from the most ancient of times, to control the information available to outsiders. During the reign of Hesperus Ancamun, the sixth sovereign after Zaccarias, Estolia created and exported maps of Western Centaurarth. Their depiction of the Western Mediterranean and Balearic Islands were accurate, but Estolia was cleverly hidden. They made it seem like a trap that would sink any ship unwise enough to stray into Estolian waters. From the 17th century through the end of the 20th century, Estolians limited what was published in encyclopedias and atlases. By the 21st century, in the so-called Information Age, efforts to remain unnoticed were more a matter of subtlety than outright deception. Meredith Zaccarian, History of Estolia.
4 weeks into the term, Lillian was working on her homework and trying to quell the feelings of frustration that kept welling up. She finished her math homework and pushed it into her satchel. She looked at the final notebook. With a slight sigh, she reached for it, pulling it towards her slowly. She ran her fingertips over the cover, took a deep breath and then flipped it open. The first 3 pages in the notebook were filled with all the questions the class had suggested during the first day of the term. She ran her finger down the list, pausing only a couple of times at the few questions she could now answer. She had gone to the local library, and even made the journey to the larger library at nearby Collins University, but there was almost no information at all about the country and even less about the religion. Estolia was an island nation with about 10,000 inhabitants. It had an inherited monarchy and had enjoyed prosperity since 720 years before the current era. It was more than 2,700 years old. It was the longest-lived nation on Earth. She followed that idea, thinking that she might discover more information if she focused on its longevity. But when she tried to look up Estolia by researching the nation with the longest lifespan, she made no progress. According to what she could uncover in the library, the nation that existed the longest was the Roman Empire, lasting a little less than 1,500 years. There was no mention at all about Estolia. The encyclopedia entry said that the Estolian language was similar to Spanish, but did not explain how they differed. The librarian, in response to her query, directed her to the Tower of Babel, by Milton Peru. When she looked in the index, she felt a leap of excitement to see more than 20 different entries for Estolia. She read through each of the referenced pages, but discovered that there was very little of use in the text. The most useful part stated,
From the 7th century BC to the end of the 5th century AD, many dialects flourished in Centrath, the sea we now call the Mediterranean. Regional dialects are more apparent in cities and towns with coastal access. Maritime commerce had the greatest influence over the way that languages matured over time. An ancient scroll discovered in a monastery in Mallorca described the city of Palmara as a complex mélange of the voices of Cella, Palmara, and Anoxes, when ships from the west were in port, and a spicy dish flavored by Roma, Greece, Arabia, and Egypt, when the ship anchored in the bay, was from the east. Most of the languages in use did not have a written counterpart. In Chapter 9, we will trace their evolution from the primitive verbal into the modern written languages like Spanish, Italian, Catalan, Portuguese, and Arabic. We would be remiss in our discussion of Centrarth if we did not make a note of 3 elaborate written languages developed in antiquity and still in use today: Hathi, Zalundi, and Estolian. The first 2 developed side by side and are nearly identical, presumed to be an offshoot of the language of Anoxes. We will end our discussion with Estolian. While it has many of the same phonemes of Spanish and Italian, it is not related to either. The symbols used in their writing are elaborate, with a certain proportion being similar or identical to the writing of other cultures. 20% are like the hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt, and 10% are like the GEs, an extinct language from northeastern Africa. Estolians describe their written language as a waterfall of words falling vertically down the page.
She spent some time looking at the illustrations showing the peculiar script of Estolia before reluctantly closing the book and returning it to the reference section. The information was tantalizing and brief, but it did not help her to make any progress on her assignment. She found one obscure reference in a society newspaper from San Francisco in 1905. The source was Quincy Lucullus Omador.
Men of Estolia are brainwashed to believe that they will be impotent if they do not marry before they turn 31. Yet another piece of evidence that the Estolian religion is really just an elaborate cult.
Aside from that one reference, she could not find anything else negative about the religion. She even researched the man who did make the one derogatory comment, but the information about him was sparse and ended with a short obituary a few years after the earthquake in San Francisco. For a religion so dominated by men, she expected to find at least a few grumblings from women, but there did not seem to be any. She closed the notebook abruptly. Chapter 8. Uncommon Invitation.
Like a soul, my soul, aflame. The woman who would compass my world was made known to me in the purity and intensity of her brilliant aura. Phineas Alistair, Zaccarian. Capitulo 81.
During one of her private meetings with Dr. Lestalt, she expressed her frustration with the assignment. The other students in the class had all discussed their assignments and remarked upon the abundance of information that was available for them to choose from. In her case, it was the opposite. Dr. Lestalt admitted, "This is why I don't put Estolia on my list, and why my class size is limited to 9. However, I would not give you an impossible assignment. As I mentioned in the beginning of the semester, I do know a few individuals who are, or will be in the United States who are members of the Estolian faith. I can arrange a meeting for you, and you can get the information directly from the source." When would I meet with them? She wanted to be successful in college after her interrupted high school years. If she failed, she would have to take another explorations course. "Let me make a call and find out." He pulled his desk telephone towards him. He had a jovial expression on his face as he dialed a phone number and leaned back in his chair. He winked at her while he listened to the phone. He left a message: "Cassiopeia, this is Eduardo Lestalt, and I was looking forward to speaking with you. I know your schedule can be difficult to pin down, so it may not be possible, but if you can spare the time, I have a student who is learning about Estolia, and I was hoping you could share with her the perspective of women in your country. Please give me a call back. I will also see if Isaiah can spare her the time. For the record, I know your Uncle Theo would consider her an ideal daughter of Estolia if he were to meet her." After he hung up, he saw the puzzled expression on her face. "They use some of the most flowery language as a matter of course," he explained. "Women are both peripheral to the religion, and the central tenet if you can imagine the dichotomy. They both love and revere women but feel that spiritual guidance is necessary only for the men of Estolia. A daughter of Estolia is one who would fit in well in their society, and who would not need religious guidance. In truth, few women from our culture could, or would, be a daughter of Estolia. When she still looked confused, he clarified, I was complimenting you on your character. How do you know so much about it? Lillian was fascinated by what he was telling her. His expression was shadowed, and he said with sadness in his voice, I had the opportunity to marry a woman from Estolia. I did not cherish her or value what she had to offer, so I ended up being the one to lose out. Lillian felt like there was something he was not saying in his response, but before she could fully analyze it, he was calling another number. Once again, he leaned back and an unruffled look of affability replaced the sadness that had colored his features. Isaiah, my good friend, he said into the phone. I call you to beg for a favor. I have a young student who's been assigned to learn everything that she can about Estolia. There is no person more qualified to share Estolia's secrets than you. He paused to listen. After a minute, he frowned slightly and said, I see, yes, of course, I realize now that the timing is difficult. We do have a week-long vacation commencing in 2 days, but I cannot be sure if my young student has specific plans. I shall inquire and call you back. He paused again for some time before telling the other person goodbye. Leaning back, he said, it appears that there is to be a ceremony in Estolia over the coming holiday. Because of this, my friend Cassiopeia will be journeying to Estolia on Friday, with plans to return by Sunday a week later. Isaiah will also be similarly busy in Estolia. After a pause, he continued, would you be willing to travel to Estolia over the vacation? There can be no greater way to learn about the land and the religion than by visiting. I couldn't possibly afford the cost of the flight. Is that the major objection you have, my dear? The cost of flying out? Or is there another reason you cannot go? A boyfriend, perhaps? She could feel the heat of a blush. Discussion of her love life was somehow embarrassing. Probably, she thought wryly, because her love life was non-existent. I've never had a boyfriend. Randolph did not count. He had never taken her on a date, kissed her only once in all the time she knew him. But I have very little aside from the full ride scholarship. I don't have a job to pay for extra things. So, it's merely finances that keep you from being able to journey to Estolia? She nodded. Excellent. Then you can go to Estolia. You see, Cassiopeia's father is a man of some import in Estolia, and for this reason, he is going to send the family jet to pick her up. They can bring you, my dear, and it won't cost them or you any money. Lillian was tempted. She pointed out, I couldn't afford a hotel. My dear, there are no hotels in Estolia. In truth, tourism itself is prohibited. It is a very insular nation that holds its secrets very close indeed. However, my good friend Isaiah knows what I do here at this university, and he will cut through the red tape to make it possible for you to visit. You will be a guest and will be provided with a guest room. This invitation is extraordinary. It is, perhaps, a testament to my friendship with the members of some of the elite families of that great nation, that they will allow me to send one of my students to visit. It is an exceptional opportunity. I would consider it a great honor if you would be willing to attend this ceremony. They have it only once every 30 or so years. It is a changing of the religious mantle to a new leader of the religion. Lillian was filled with enthusiasm at the thought of going to an exotic location. Before she could have second thoughts, she agreed to spend her spring vacation in the small country of Estolia as Cassiopeia's guest. Chapter 9. Daughter of Estolia. Each monarch of Estolia has his own story worth telling, and it nearly always begins, and frequently ends with that extraordinary event that comes with finding the one woman able to keep his soul. From the inception of our nation, We have been admonished to record these pivotal events as one of our primary obligations. If we fail to share our trials and triumphs with the next generation, we might, like Peritasis in the time of Apollyon, end up complicit in the failure of the systems established to keep us a safe and blessed nation until time ceases to be time. Kaitheros, excerpt from the birth blessing of the 43rd king of Estolia. Isaiah looked at the dossier as it printed out, studying the features of the young woman who would be flying out to Estolia with his sister. Once the printer stopped spitting out papers, he dialed the number of the American university professor who once had the chance to enjoy the richest blessings of Estolia but who, in his ignorance, spurned the opportunity. "You received the information?" The professor did not waste words. Isaiah looked again at the eyes of the woman in the photo. "Yes, though the information is quite sparse. What makes you think this woman could be a daughter of Estolia? Few women from the United States had the necessary temperament, much less purity of body, self, and soul, to find happiness in Estolia. I don't know why I am convinced of this, it is something I can't personally fathom. I was having lunch with Cassiopeia, and when I saw Taryn Lilane, I was amazed at the imperative I had to assure she learned of Estolia, and if possible, met with you." The door to Isaiah's office opened and he smiled at his uncle as he entered the room. Isaiah returned his attention to the telephone, yielding up the photograph when his uncle reached for it. "Once I had this feeling that she must learn about Estolia, go there if possible. I thought fate would intervene and keep me from following up on this most extraordinary impulse I've ever had. Before I could even begin to find out who she was, she boarded a bus and was gone." The professor paused before saying, "I was asked the very next day if I would be willing to allow another person to take my exploration of world religions class. I was amazed when the class began and, arriving late to class, was the woman I'd seen the previous day. Deity was not willing to be denied. I assigned her to research Estolia." "She will travel with Cassiopeia?" "Yes, I was able to convince her to make the journey." Isaiah looked up at his uncle in amazement when he took the phone and spoke into it. "Eduardo, it is Theo. You must tell me about this young woman." Isaiah had seen his uncle in the grip of a vision numerous times. As the keeper, his was a great burden, to see into the hearts of men and women. There was something unique about the young woman they were discussing. While his uncle discussed her, Isaiah looked through the papers that accompanied the photograph. He saw that she lost her parents as a toddler and was raised by an elderly couple who had recently passed on. She was considered extremely gifted based on her standardized test scores, though quite sheltered. During her first term at the university, she took a heavy load of classes and received top marks. This term she had been encouraged to take a slightly lighter load. From what he could tell, she had been raised without any specific religious influence. "We will receive her visit with great delight," Theo said. "If she is, in fact, a true daughter of Estolia, we will expect you to help out on your end." Once he hung up, Theo turned to look at Isaiah. "I have never, as keeper, felt this way about any woman. Even when I met my Kaylee, the touch of deity was not as strong as the certainty I feel within me that this woman is right for you." He took a deep breath before asking, "Are you prepared for this?" Isaiah nodded. He grew up knowing what his duties and obligations were. He had the opportunity to enjoy his freedom, spending 4 years going to college in the United States, partaking of the casual relationships that so permeated that society. Since he returned to Estolia, those pursuits seemed shallow and meaningless, and he focused his attention on learning everything that would be necessary to pilot his nation through the uncharted waters of an increasingly complex world. His blessing at 18 was specific about the woman he would find to keep his soul. He thought now of the words within it that focused on his romantic future.
Each sovereign of Estolia is given both the greatest blessing and has the most profound obligation to fulfill. As the man destined to be the 88th king after Zaccarias, you will not have to search for the woman to keep your soul. She will visit Estolia as you near the age of 30, and the extraordinary aura you will see will affirm her place as your bride. Your heart will be as involved as your body, self, and soul by the eve of your birthday. Know that deity is pleased with the quality of your character, the refinement of your soul, and the woman you will discover will be the greatest of all blessings, your reward for the purity of your perspective. Be ever mindful of the roles of both the keeper and the last resort. Never allow your emotions or feelings to supersede your understanding of their roles or their words. Remember to listen to them, always.
He was certain the upcoming visit would clarify many things for him regarding his future, and that of Estolia as a nation. Eduardo believed she was the woman who would keep his soul. Hope surged through him. He didn't see the frown of concern on his uncle's face as he looked at the photograph one last time. Chapter 10. Vacation. Glorious Estolia. A hidden paradise where dreams come true, where the soul rejoices. Where love at first sight is normal, and family relationships are the foundation of faith. Juliana Maria Zaccarian, Ensayo 84. Lilane paid the taxi driver and then looked at the small building. The main terminal at the airport was more than a mile away. She was directed to come to the smaller auxiliary building. She was not sure exactly what to do from this point on. When a vivacious woman around her own age came up to her smiling, she smiled back shyly.
You must be Taryn. I am Cassiopeia Zaccarian. It would please me if you would call me Cassie. My family calls me that. The other is quite a mouthful anyway. My family is quite fond of long, complicated names. Mother said she saw the constellation from the deck of the Promise of Deity when she first sailed to Estolia, and vowed to herself that she would name her daughter Cassiopeia.
While she was speaking, a couple of somber men in suits came and picked up Lilane's luggage. I actually prefer to be called Lilane. Cassie hooked her arm with Lilane's and steered her towards the main building.
I can already tell that we shall be great friends.
She burbled on, happily guiding Lilane through the building and out another door that led to the tarmac. A small private jet stood near the building, with a set of mobile stairs leading up to the open door. Cassie blithely led Lilane up the stairs and into the airplane.
I am sorry to hustle you up like this, but when it is time to return to Estolia, I am always most anxious. The sooner we are boarded, the sooner we are on our way. You will love my country.
Over the course of the flight, Lilane did more listening than speaking. She learned a lot about the country of Estolia. Cassie had a bubbly personality and the ability to talk endlessly. She learned that the island nation had been in existence longer than any other.
You will not find that information in encyclopedias,
Cassie confided.
We like our privacy much too much to be a curiosity. We have been able to remain shielded from scrutiny because of our lack of resources. No gold or diamonds or oil. No major exports. Self-sufficient and unimportant. We like it that way.
Even atlases don't seem to have much information on Estolia, Lilane pointed out. Cassie giggled, explaining.
They need to have permission for more than the most basic information, and my father refuses to give it.
Your father? Dr. Lestalt told me that your father was a man of some import in your country.
Of course, you could not know, but yes, he is one of the most important men in the country. My uncle has 3 titles. He is first consul to the king, last resort, and the keeper of the soul of Estolia.
What does all that mean? Lilane asked.
Being keeper means,
Cassie said slowly, as if gathering her thoughts,
that he is the leader of the Estolian religion. He receives inspiration from deity, gives special blessings, and oversees the religious and historical education of the young men of Estolia. It is considered the most powerful position in Estolia, even more powerful than the king.
Is every inhabitant of your nation also a member of the religion? Lillian was fascinated by the intricacies of the tiny nation.
Yes, of course.
Cassie said as if there was never any doubt.
My uncle says that those who do not feel the faith in their heart and soul would not feel comfortable living in Estolia. They leave, and are much happier.
What does last resort mean?
If the heir to the throne, the heir apparent, cannot fulfill his obligations, it is the duty of the last resort to be the one to step in and do so. It is a very important role. My brother Isaiah will be able to explain to you more of this, as it has to do with the obligations imposed by our faith, specifically regarding the royal succession.
And what was the third thing you said about your uncle?
He is the first consul. This means he is the first man the king goes to when he needs advice. If something terrible were to happen to the king, the first consul would take over until the heir apparent was ready to be king.
Later in the flight, Lillian asked, "Why do you live in the States?" Cassie flushed, looking momentarily unhappy.
There is no man in my country who has touched my heart. Not all women who are born there are true daughters of Estolia, with but one soul worthy of their keeping. Those who cannot find a soulmate on the island tend to leave Estolia and search in the greater world. Despite the great blessing my uncle gave me 7 days after I was born, which he repeated when I turned 18, that I was indeed a true daughter of Estolia, I fear that the man whose soul I could keep does not exist or will, like my family's good friend Eduardo Lestalt, reject his Kaylee.
Lillian processed all that Cassie told her. She could tell that there were some chasms in her grasp of the intricacies of the Estolian perspective. I don't understand this keeping of the soul stuff. Cassie brightened, saying,
A man's soul is unhappy until it finds its true home, in the keeping of his Kaylee. This is the woman who, in your world, would be called wife. But in our world, it means much, much more. When he meets the woman who is destined to be his, he will know it and must act on it. If he hands his soul into her keeping, he must choose to marry her. No man can live without his soul. If he spurns the woman, his Kaylee, he will die.
The explanation did not exactly clear everything up. Dr. Lestalt mentioned something about that, but I thought it was a long time ago that he loved and lost. A sad expression settled on Cassie's face. She explained.
In his case, he met the woman who should have been his Kaylee, but he never gave his soul into her keeping. The soul knows its home, and having found it, it will never settle any other place. So, he lives without the love that he spurned.
What happened to her?
She was thrown from her horse and died. My aunt. Eduardo has always been a great friend of the family. His loss was even more extreme than our own. I do not remember my aunt, as she died before I was born. But Eduardo has been like an uncle to the three of us, my brothers and I, that is. Likely he would have seen the truth and come to entrust her with his soul, but he was denied that chance.
It sounds like you have an amazing country and an even more amazing set of beliefs. Lillian wondered if it would be possible to properly understand a faith without in some way living it. The intercom in the airplane suddenly came to life, and Lillian listened to the foreign words with curiosity. This was the first time she heard the actual language of Estolia. She found it exotic, fluid, and evocative. When the announcement ended, Cassie unbuckled her seatbelt and jumped to her feet.
The captain says there is just the right amount of time for the two of us to dress for our arrival.
Dress for our arrival? She had handed over her suitcases when she got to the airplane. I don't have a change of clothing available in my carry-on bag. Cassie grinned at her.
Eduardo knew, as a man with great perception, that you would feel awkward if you were not properly dressed during this visit. He shared this concern with me, and I have remedied the situation. We are exactly the same size, so you will be able to use some of my own items of apparel. I will have a special gown commissioned for the celebration, of course, and they will make one for you at the same time. It will be extraordinarily exciting.
Cassie was an irresistible force. It would do no good to argue. She followed Cassie to a room at the tail of the airplane with 2 gowns hanging from hooks. Cassie crossed over to the green gown and said,
This color is not flattering on me. It would be absolutely splendid with your red hair.
40 minutes later, Lilane was staring at herself in a full-length mirror in amazement. The dress was off the shoulder, showing more cleavage than she normally exposed, and was the most extravagant thing she had ever owned or worn. She looked over at Cassie, whose darker beauty was absolutely stunning in the purple and green gown. The flight crew were all wearing outfits that were purple and green. Are these colors special in some way?
Our flag is mostly purple and green. They are the state colors.
Lilane followed Cassie to their seats, and about 5 minutes later the jet began its final approach. Cassie reached across the aisle and took Lilane's hand, smiling happily at her new friend as if they had been friends for years instead of only the duration of one long transatlantic flight. Chapter 11. Heir Apparant. Coronation in Estolia always takes place on the same day, and usually in the same ceremony, wherein the heir apparent receives his birth blessing, 7 days after his birth. This has not changed in 66 generations, and it will not change in the future. The ceremony is subject to the whims of the Strellerin as to the order of events, the location, and other important details. It is, however, one of the most satisfying ceremonies for all Estolians, knowing that their newest monarch has fulfilled the promise of Zaccarias, and guaranteed the citizenry another 30 years of peace and prosperity. Malachi Tobias Zaccarian, Capitulo 66. Shortly after the airplane taxied to a halt, the stewardess opened the door. Cassie was eager to disembark. Lilane felt a sense of adventure to be visiting this strange land with such peculiar customs. As she approached the door, she told herself firmly that she would enjoy every minute, store up every memory, and not worry about the minutiae of fitting in, proper behavior, or anything else. She would focus on having fun and let the future direct itself for the duration of the visit. Several horse-drawn carriages greeted them, as well as an assemblage of individuals who looked very much like they must be members of the ruling class. Cassie might be more than simply the niece of the last resort. Remembering her vow to enjoy every element of her unusual vacation, she lifted her chin slightly and smiled more broadly. Cassie grinned at her and they began to descend the stairs, carefully due to the voluminous skirts they both wore. At the bottom of the stairs, Cassie grabbed Lilane's hand and led her towards the man at the head of the small group. He was wearing a richly embroidered cape, a ceremonial sword, and a crown. He looked very much like he could be a prince or a king. Cassie launched herself into his arms, receiving a loving embrace. With her arm around his waist she said, "Lilane, this is my father, Balthazar Leopold Zaccarian, Duke, Sovereign, and King of Estolia. Father, this is Taryn Lilane, a protégé of Eduardo Lestalt. She prefers to go by the name of Lilane." She was still processing the implications of the introduction, that Cassie's father was the king, when he hugged her and kissed her on both cheeks and smiled into her eyes. "I hope I may call you Lilane, and I would be pleased if you would do me the honor of calling me Leo." Lilane saw sincerity and genuine pleasure in his eyes and said, "Thank you." With his arm around her shoulders, he guided her to another man who looked very similar to him, with slightly longer blonde hair, a goatee, and wearing purple and green robes that looked vaguely religious, something like the robes of a monk. A black sash went from his right shoulder down to his left hip. "May I present my brother, Theobald Reginald Zaccarian, my first consul, my last resort, and keeper of the soul of Estolia. Theo, this is Taryn Lilane." He gripped both of her hands and held them for an extended time, his eyes searching hers. When he finally spoke, she could tell that something had disturbed him in some way. With a strange note in his voice, he said to her, "I am pleased to meet you, Taryn Lilane. I see now why our good friend Eduardo felt you should visit Estolia. You could easily be a daughter of Estolia. In truth, you honor us by your presence." He smiled before asking her, "Will you do me the greatest honor and allow me to give you a formal blessing during your visit?" He must have sensed her reluctance. He added, "You would sit in a special chair, and I and my nephew would place our hands upon your head. We would then say a special prayer in the Estolian language. As a further gift to you, you would be presented with a scroll containing the words of the blessing, in both Estolian as well as the best possible translation into English. It would not take more than half an hour of your time, but it would give me great pleasure." Lilane nodded acquiescence. "I should like, now, to introduce you to Lazarus Ezekiel Zaccarian, my nephew, and Cassie's younger brother. He is my assistant and will soon take on the role of last resort. Eventually, he will take over my positions as first consul and keeper. Zeke, this is Taryn Lilane." He was in his late 20s with light brown, almost blonde hair, and amber-colored eyes. He pulled her into his arms for a hug and then looked at her with the same intensity of purpose, if only for a moment before he grinned at his uncle. "I see what you mean, Uncle Theo." The last person to greet her stepped forward. Whereas Zeke was dressed reminiscent of the monk, this man was dressed in the style of the king, with a similar cape and ornamental sword. He did not have a crown. His hair was a deep mahogany with incongruous light grey eyes. His eyes met hers with a peculiar intensity. The king stepped forward again and said to her, "This is my oldest son, heir to the throne, he whose burdens and blessings are the greatest in the service of Estolia. Isaiah Monterey Zaccarian. Isaiah, may I present the delightful Taryn Lilane who comes to us as a visitor, but who is worthy to be called a daughter of Estolia." He smiled and leaned forward to press his cheek briefly to her own. "I am delighted to meet you, Taryn Lilane. Welcome to Estolia. We are truly blessed by your visit. You light up our nation with the radiant beauty of your aura." He turned and smiled at his father before asking Lilane, "I would be delighted if you would ride back to the palace with me in my carriage." Lilane took his arm, feeling the lean strength of his flesh beneath the trappings of civilization. She felt the heat of a blush on her face as she climbed into the foremost open-topped carriage. Once she was seated, Isaiah sat across from her and the carriage started out with a couple of men on horseback leading the way. For a while they traveled in silence. Lilane looked at the beautiful countryside. Finally, her attention turned to the handsome man seated across from her. "Your family is very generous. Cassie seems a most extraordinary person. I'm glad I had the chance to meet her. Eduardo is a great family friend. He has never recommended any person to our family who is unworthy of our friendship. We are grateful you have allowed us to share our country with you." "What is this ceremony that is taking place this week?" she asked. "I will be turning 30 in 5 days. The day before my birthday, my Uncle Theo will pass the position of last resort to my brother Zeke. This is what we will be celebrating. Uncle Theo will instruct Zeke in giving a royal blessing. Did he make you uncomfortable with his request?" One of his eyebrows quirked upward. "Not really. I don't mind receiving a blessing." She decided to share with him, "I plan to enjoy every minute of my unexpected vacation. I might not want to leave at the end of my stay." Isaiah's eyes were warm on hers as he said, "I have no doubt that you will feel as though this is your home by the end of the week. You will always be welcome in Estolia." Turning slightly, he gestured ahead of the carriage. The carriage was now traveling down a narrow valley. To their left was a beautiful structure that looked like a cathedral. On their right, the road they were on was heading up the side of the mountain. She followed the meandering road with her eyes, and when she reached the end her breath left her in a long drawn-out sound of appreciation. Atop the mountain was an immense turreted palace with a pyramid-like peak. From their vantage point it looked enormous, larger than life. I have lived my entire life in the palace. I often forget how magnificent it is. It is only when we have visitors like yourself that I am reminded how truly unique it is. When they arrived in the forecourt, he climbed out of the carriage and then turned to offer her a hand so he could help her disembark. Once she was safely on the ground, he put an arm around her shoulders and turned her towards the front of the palace. It was extraordinary. Too much to take in at once, with arches, columns, and towers. In addition, it was pristine, as if it was only just constructed. They stood near a set of stairs that came together where they were standing. About a dozen or so steps up, the stairs split in two, one set going to the right, one to the left. Where they split was a remarkable carving of a flag with strange writing beneath it. The dual staircase climbed for some distance and then doubled back, meeting up just as the stairs reached the third level in front of the main entrance to the palace. While Lilane was admiring the architecture, a beautiful woman descended the stairs. She reached them just as Cassie, her father, brother, and uncle all climbed out of the second carriage and joined them. Isaiah placed a hand between Lilane's shoulder blades and urged her towards the woman. "Lilane, this is my mother, Jacqueline Cathay Zaccarian, Queen of Estolia, my father's Kaylee. She prefers to go by the name of Jackie. Mother, this is Taryn Lilane, who, as I understand it, prefers the name Lilane." She was beautiful. She had thick chocolate brown curly hair with only a few strands turning silver with age, a willowy body, and warm brown eyes. "Lilane, it is such a pleasure to meet you. Eduardo was most impressed with you, and we're delighted to show off our tiny country to you." While she was speaking, another individual descended the staircase, and she turned to him. "This is a distant relative from France, Morgan Luc Dumaine. Morgan, may I present my daughter, Cassiopeia Zaccarian, and her friend Taryn Lilane." "Enchanté," he said in French, before adding in English, "It is a delight to meet two lovely young ladies." Lilane was enthralled by the extraordinarily fine architecture, the intricate stone carvings and beautiful statues. She smiled at Isaiah, saying, "It's marvelous." "I am glad you like my home," he said with a wide smile. They all began the climb up the many steps leading to the grand entrance. Lilane's hand on Isaiah's sleeve, Cassie's hand on Morgan's. Chapter 12. To see the dawn. From his first vision of Mount Estoliana, Zaccarias envisioned his descendants riding to the peak and watching the glory of the sunrise. When Zaccarian was ready to celebrate his 18th birthday, Zaccarias gave him his blessing at 18 and established a tradition of riding to the peak to view the dawn on those pivotal moments in the lives of Estolians that were notable and worthy of mention. Thaddeus Macarios Zaccarian, Capitulo 79. Over the next 3 days, Lilane, Cassie, Morgan, and Isaiah spent almost all of their time together. On the first day, Lilane admitted that she had never ridden a horse. Isaiah immediately offered to have her ride double with him on his massive white Andy stallion, Zaruth. With Isaiah astride his stallion, man and steed were two of the most dynamic individuals of their kind that she had ever seen. He told her that, if she was going to be on the island longer, he would have given her riding lessons. But it didn't make sense to waste her limited time in Estolia with lessons when Zaruth was strong enough to carry both. At the end of the third day she was in her undergarments, dressing for dinner. A knock on her door heralded a visitor. Hastily, Lilane picked up her dress and held it in front of her. The concept of personal privacy was a little skewed in Estolia. A knock on the door was typically followed immediately by the door opening. She relaxed when she saw it was Cassie. "Oh good," Cassie exclaimed, moving forward to where Lilane was standing. "You chose the gold dress." She was quick to help Lilane into the old-fashioned garment. Cassie spoke non-stop, about the things they had done that day, about the things they would do the next day, and about Morgan Luc Dumaine. It was only when Lilane was ready to go with her to the master dining room that Cassie finally stopped talking and led the way out of the guest suite. Cassie was so bubbly and self-assured that it was easy to think of her as being perfectly confident about her life and her place in the world. There must be a reason for Cassie's silence. "Is something wrong, Cassie?" she asked tentatively. She'd never had a friend to care about. She did not want to pry, but sensed that it was rare for Cassie to be silent. Cassie opened her mouth to say something, but they were interrupted by Cassie's mother urging them to hurry up. Cassie grabbed Lilane's hand and they walked together to the dining room. The evening meal was as pleasant and as beautifully presented as every other meal. Lilane became accustomed to being waited upon by cheerful Estolians who all treated the king and the royal family with familiarity. They were enjoying a confection at the end of the meal when Isaiah said, "Tomorrow morning I would like to watch the sun rise from the top of Mount Estoliana." Theo responded, "I will not be able to accompany you." Apologetically, Leo said, "I, too, will not be able to make it this time." "Morgan and I want to come," Cassie said. She threw a saucy dimpled grin towards their other guest. Morgan was swift to agree. "Will you be able to accompany us, Lilane?" Isaiah asked. "It is something that every person should experience at least once in their lifetime. It won't be too much for Zareth?" she asked. "No, he is very powerful, and you are not heavy. I would be most pleased if you would accompany us." Isaiah's softly spoken invitation was all it took for her to agree. She pushed her roiling emotions into the background. She didn't need to think about her past right now. Lilane leaned back against Isaiah, feeling Zareth take a deep breath. They were on the lesser peak of Mount Estoliana, and the first streaks of dawn were starting to lighten the iron grey of pre-dawn. Cassie and Morgan were some distance away, talking softly, their voices an indistinct mumble on the crisp morning air. As the sky progressed through a rainbow of colors until it was a blazing fiery red, Isaiah's arms around her waist grew tighter, silently sharing with her the panoramic beauty. She rested her hands on his in front of her and absently stroked them. "Tonight is a special night," he said, once the sky lost the last hint of rose. His breath was warm on her ear as he spoke. "Uncle Theo has decided that his last formal act before the ceremony will be the blessing he will give you." Isaiah turned Zareth away from the precipice and started down the pathway they climbed an hour earlier in near total darkness. Cassie and Morgan followed on their horses. "I understand you and Cassie have special gowns you will wear," Isaiah said. "I am looking forward to seeing what the dressmaker was able to create. If it's your birthday tomorrow, do your family have any special plans?" "Indeed," his voice rumbled in his chest. "There are some special plans in the works. Tonight, I will share some of those plans with you. You did, after all, venture to Estolia to learn about the religion, yes? Your birthday celebrations have a religious element?" Over the last few days they did not spend much time talking about religion. She enjoyed their activities so much she did not want to remember her reasons for being in Estolia. Indeed. For Estolian men, the most pivotal year of their life is their 30th year. She could hear the smile in his voice. "As I am to be king, it is more momentous for me than for any other man." The half-formed notion that he might be attracted to her came crashing to earth. This man, no matter how human and approachable, was going to be a king someday. He would not want a little nobody like her permanently in his life. Even if he did, she had her own insurmountable barriers. She wished she had never heard of Estolia. Life would be more barren after she returned to Alabama than it would have been if she never came here and met Isaiah. No other man could be as interesting or vibrant. She would store up her memories and pull them out to cherish them throughout her long, lonely life. She had only a few days left to fill with enough happiness to last her a lifetime. At the base of the mountain, Isaiah reined Zareth to a halt. "This is the royal cathedral, and beyond it, built into the mountain itself, is our temple," he said to her. "Your blessing and the other elements of the ceremony will be held here in the cathedral tonight. Afterwards we will travel back to the palace for the celebration in the grand ballroom." "I'm looking forward to it," she said. For the night, at least, she would be able to forget reality, Randolph, and Alabama and immerse herself in the fantasy that Isaiah was seriously interested in her, and that she was free to be with him. I, too, am looking forward to it, he said. He reined Zurith away from the temple and then pulled up abruptly at the sight of Morgan leaning across the gap between his and Cassie's horses to kiss her. She noticed her brother watching them and pulled away from Morgan to canter back towards the palace. Morgan glanced towards them and then set out after Cassie, a determined expression on his face. I see that I shall have to have a discussion with Morgan, Isaiah said, his tone dark and forbidding. Lilane was depressed at the thought that Isaiah could as easily be warning her off as planning on warning off Morgan. Later that afternoon, the two women prepared for the gala evening. Cassie was silent and withdrawn. When she was fastening the buttons on Lilane's dress, she asked, "What do you think of Morgan? He is quite handsome and appears to be quite taken with you." "I think, if he had the chance," Cassie said slowly, "that he would seduce me." She looked off into the distance with a frown. When her eyes met Lilane's, her expression grew more light-hearted and she laughed wickedly. "I do believe, Lilane, I would let him seduce me," she sighed before saying, "but my brother will warn him off." Lilane had no idea how to respond to that. Isaiah had never given the slightest inclination to kiss her or seduce her. She wouldn't have minded a little bit of seduction. "Has any man ever seduced you, Lilane?" "Me?" she squeaked, incredulous. "I've never been that close to any man." She thought about the one man who had been close enough to possess her and was grateful, for the 100th time, that his peculiar drives did not extend to what she could offer. Cassie laughed. "You are quite beautiful. If you gave my brother encouragement, he would seduce you." "Cassie." "Lilane." Cassie parroted back. "Tonight, my brother will monopolize your time. I am glad. This way I will be able to take all of Morgan's time." Chapter 13. Ceremony. Each of the descendants of Zaccarias receives a birth blessing 7 days after being born and a blessing at 18 on the eve of their birthday. It is a test of faith to believe in the words bestowed, both the mundane and the fantastic, the seemingly impossible and the expected. Deity guides and tests each Estolian in this way. Traverse Montague Zaccarian, Capitulo 60. By the time they left the palace, the sun was dropping rapidly toward the horizon. They traveled in open-topped carriages from the palace to the cathedral. Both Zeke and Isaiah helped her out of the carriage. Isaiah was wearing a crown that was less ornate than his father's. Both men wore heavily embroidered capes and had swords in scabbards. Zeke dressed like his uncle, wore the same green and purple ecclesiastical robes. His expression was solemn, serious, dignified. The cathedral was filled with Estolians who were there to witness the ceremony. 4 individuals that Lilane met earlier were seated to one side. The 2 men were nearly identical to look at, except that one was seated in an ornate wheelchair. Both men had their wives at their sides. The one in the wheelchair was Isaiah's grandfather, Xavier, and his identical twin was the former king. She was struck, yet again, by the lively interest and life in their eyes. Age and infirmity might be taking their toll on the older generation, but that didn't seem to have any impact on their intellect and awareness. Isaiah led Lilane up onto the platform and had her sit on a gilt stool. She had been told she should sit with her hands settled on her knees, her head bent, eyes closed. She felt strangely confident as she sat there. Zeke and Theo placed their hands on her head and she listened raptly to their rich language. She often forgot English was not the language of Estolia since they spoke mostly in English around her. While Theo's rich voice echoed through the silent cathedral, she tried to get a sense of the language. Like Spanish but with its own unique style and flavor. Melodic and exotic. If she could have understood the blessing, she would have heard.
In this transcendent period of knowledge without wisdom, it is not enough to keep the promise of Zaccarias, nor partake of the blessings promised by deity. This daughter of Estolia will have a pivotal role in Estolia's future. 3 sons will bless her womb, 1 to rule Estolia, 1 to safely keep her soul, and 1 to act as a catalyst of change in the greater world. This woman is worthy to keep the soul of the king. Only through the salvation of the planet will Estolia remain safe. This flame-haired woman will have a lasting impact on the nation. As a catalyst of change, her 3rd son will be instrumental in the rebirth of a golden era of global cooperation. Though her trials have already surpassed those experienced by any other queen of Estolia, she has come out of those tribulations pure and able to keep the soul of our future king. She is worthy of the blessings promised to Zaccarias and Estoliana. The strength she will bring cannot be measured. Her compassion and empathy will bring solace to many. Through her place in Estolian society, she will enrich all who touch her life. This gentlewoman is a worthy successor to Estoliana. Through her impact, the keeper will discover within himself a greater power than any other keeper, including Zaccarias. This worthy daughter of Estolia will be remembered among the greatest of all our queens. The blessings of deity upon her and her posterity are as bright as the aura that confirms each Kaylee, as bright as her fiery hair. She will try the faith of many in the crucible of their inner convictions and strengthen their faith through that trial by fire. Deity commands that all who hear or read this blessing remember, above other considerations, that this daughter of Estolia is worthy of this future. She is worthy of the soul that will come into her keeping. All who will interact with this woman, as the woman whom deity proclaims worthy of being the Kaylee of our king, are admonished to remember what has been stated here today. We say these things within the light and sight of deity.
For just a moment after Theo stopped speaking, the entire gathered crowd was utterly silent, perhaps in tribute to the words he could not understand. A subdued murmur filled the cathedral as Zeke gently urged her to her feet. Isaiah escorted her to sit between his mother and sister before returning to stand next to his brother. Theo spoke to the gathered individuals before pulling an ornate gem-encrusted dagger from inside the black sash crossing his chest. He held it aloft and spoke again, briefly. This time his words were aimed at the other individuals on the stage. When he finished speaking, Isaiah responded by holding both of his hands out, palms upward. Theo placed the dagger on them. Next, the king unpinned the black sash from Theo's outfit, bowing before handing it to Theo. The 2 older men smiled at one another before Theo carefully pinned the sash to Zeke's outfit. He then gestured Zeke towards his brother, who held out the dagger. The brothers spoke to each other before the younger man took the dagger, held it aloft, said one final thing, before slotting it within the black sash. Zeke then sat on the same stool that Lelaine had occupied, and Isaiah left the stage to return to sit with her. He put his arm around her, and gave his attention to the events on the stage. Theo placed his hands upon Zeke's head, and gave another blessing. It was as long, or longer than the one she received, and she could feel Isaiah tensing up slightly as it went on for some time. Chapter 14. The Ball. The instruction that occurs within the temple is one of the first systemic, organized educational systems in the world. Much of what Amador developed in the infancy of Estolia is still in use in our modern day. The instruction of literacy was taught to young Estolians with a fervor and dedication that was unique in that era. In the beginning, it was also the best way to preserve the early records. Each acolyte was given the task to take and copy the sacred writings so that they would have their own copy of the capítulos and ensayos. No other nation has ever had as high a literacy rate as Estolia. Meredith Zaccarian, History of Estolia. When the ceremony was over, Isaiah helped her to her feet and escorted her out of the building ahead of everyone else. Everyone watched them. Lelaine lifted her chin, focused on walking steadily at Isaiah's side. During the carriage ride back to the palace, he explained, "In our faith, the firstborn son of the king becomes the next king 7 days after the birth of his oldest son, his heir. What if your wife couldn't have children or didn't live long enough to give you a son? There has never failed to be a son born to each king. It is one of the promises deity made to us. 3 times in the history of my lineage the heir apparent could not fulfill the duties of his role. In each case there was a second son, or the son of the keeper, to take up the mantle of duty and become king. My father is the son of the former keeper. He became king when his cousin, my uncle Sebastian, abdicated. If one woman keeps the soul of a man, what happens if the marriage is dissolved, or the woman dies? Coming from a culture so entirely different from my own, you might find it strange to hear that divorce is unheard of in Estolia. And if the wife dies?" she asked again. The carriage came to a halt and a footman opened the door and placed the stool for them to alight. Isaiah escorted her up the stairs so the long line of carriages following their own could disgorge their passengers. Once within the foyer, he led her to a small breakfast room instead of the ballroom. He picked up both of her hands, his grey eyes meeting her green ones. "A man cannot live without his soul, Lilane. No man gives his soul into the keeping of a woman without realizing he is tied to her in life and in death." She searched his eyes, he believed what he was saying. He leaned forward to kiss her, his lips warm on hers. Before she had a chance to react, he pulled back and smiled at her and then led her from the room, down to the ballroom. Isaiah was commanded to begin the dancing, and he escorted Lilane out to the floor. Soon, the dance floor filled up. Over the course of the evening, she danced with some of the men she met in Estolia. Most of the time she was paired with Isaiah. The crowd thinned as the evening wore on, and by midnight, only the family remained in the ballroom. Cassie had danced as often with Morgan as Lilane danced with Isaiah. Theo came up to where they were dancing and put one hand on each of their shoulders. "The orchestra is packing up after this number is over," he informed them. "I shall see you tomorrow, Isaiah." Isaiah smiled at Lilane and said, "Come, I enjoyed our earlier conversation in the carriage. I would like to explain more about the significance of the keeping of the soul." He extended a hand to her. She went with him easily, following as he led her to a part of the palace unfamiliar to her. When he entered a bedroom, she hesitated. His bringing her to his or any other bedroom seemed out of character and improper. He escorted her to a group of chairs opposite the large bed. Once she was seated, she tried to ignore the bed behind him. Rather than sit in the opposite chair, he sank to his knees in front of her. "In my faith," he said, his hands on her thighs, stroking her skin through the fabric of her ball gown, "the keeping of the soul is irrevocable. Once a man turns 30, it is his duty to find a woman into whose keeping he can place his soul." He leaned towards her, his lips caressing hers, one hand warm on her face. He pulled back slightly. "You are so lovely, Lilane. I wish to place my soul within your keeping," he whispered. She thought she understood what he was saying but was not sure. She wanted to know this man in a way Randolph never once inspired, to give herself to him. He kissed her again. After several blissful minutes, he climbed to his feet and pulled her up and into his arms, one hand going to caress the side of her face, the other exerting gentle pressure on the small of her back, pulling her body up against his. His mouth over hers was mobile, alive, nibbling, tasting, teasing. He deepened the kiss, and she was enthralled, caught up in the sensations building between them. When she felt the hard pressure of his arousal against her, she pulled back, shocked. "Lilane," he whispered. His eyes were dilated as he looked at her. "Oh, Lilane," he said again before his mouth settled once more over hers in a kiss that was no longer restrained. She returned his kiss with equal passion, feeling intoxicated by how close he was, the feel of his strong body against her own. Just how they went from standing and fully dressed, to lying on his bed in their undergarments, she did not know. She became aware of where they were when he pushed the edge of her bra down and took her nipple into his mouth. She moaned at the sensation, running her hands over his back. Isaiah, we should stop. She was distracted by the feel of his hand under her dainty briefs. No, Lilane, we should not stop, he said, cupping her, feeling the heat of her arousal. There has never been anything in my life more right than this is, right now. Say you will be mine. Logic and sense fled. She wanted him, his possession, this memory. Yes, Isaiah. The clock began to chime the hour as he pulled the last of her garments off, divesting himself of his own. The reverberations of the final chime of the clock were still echoing through the palace when his body merged with hers. The momentary discomfort hardly registered before she felt a fullness that seemed to extend from her body to her soul. She surrendered both body and soul up to him as they enacted the most elemental of dances. When he finally called out to her, she felt as though the universe itself came to a halt in tribute to the fundamental beauty of their union. Chapter 15. A Lesson in Theology. The pinnacle moments in the life of the sovereign and keeper must be recorded in the capitulos. It is required of the Streloran of Estolia, the 4 men most responsible for keeping Zaccarias' promise. Lessons learned in one lifetime will enhance the decisions of future generations in profound ways. Cristoforo Alexius Zaccarian, Capitulo 64. They were both breathing heavily when he pulled away from her, tucking her body tightly up against his, her head on his shoulder, his hand stroking her hair. She listened to the beating of his heart, feeling transformed in a way she never would have, or could have imagined. It was only as his heart settled down to a steady even rhythm that the implications began to sink in. "My soul is in your keeping," he said to her. His voice was solemn. His eyes studied hers. His hand settled over her abdomen and he asked her, "Lilane, will you cherish my soul? Bear our children? Share my burdens? Be my queen?" Overwhelmed, she closed her eyes, processing all he was saying, all they had spoken about over the course of the day. As she processed all the information she had gathered in her time on the island, his heartbeat started to race. "Isaiah, I want nothing more out of life than to stay with you here in Estolia, by your side. If only it was possible. But perhaps it was? The barriers were not insurmountable. Perhaps Isaiah would understand." She allowed herself to hope, to dream. He pulled her close in a crushing embrace before glancing at the clock. He kissed her again before rising to walk to a chest at the foot of the bed. Opening it, he pulled out a white silky nightgown and a purple and green bathrobe. After shrugging into the robe, he handed the nightgown to her. "Put this on." She slipped the nightgown over her head, watching as he crossed to pick up and neatly fold the items of apparel that littered the floor in a near straight line from the chair to the bed. He was just settling her elaborate ball gown over the back of the chair when the clock struck the half-hour. He crossed the room swiftly to where she stood next to the bed and pulled her close against his body in a hug. The door opened and his father, Theo, and Zeke entered the room. Isaiah slid behind her and pulled her body up against his, one hand resting lightly on her abdomen. All 3 men approached, but Theo was the one who appeared to be in charge. Lilane remembered that nobody married in this nation without his approval. She wondered if she would be found wanting. Theo's eyes never left Lilane's. "Isaiah? I have placed my soul in Taryn Lilane's keeping." Isaiah's voice was rich and satisfied. Theo was silent for so long Lilane became uncomfortable, especially when it became obvious that his silence was unusual. She could feel Isaiah tensing up behind her, and both the king and Zeke looked at Theo curiously. Finally, he asked her, "Have you accepted his soul, his burden, his seed?" "I have," she said, not sure if that was the correct response. Again, the silence was uncomfortable. The large standing clock by the door was the only noise, ticking in the background. To Lilane, it was like a doomsday clock, ticking down the last of her happiness. Theo's expression was inscrutable, unhappy. He looked like he was preparing to tell someone they lost a member of their family in some dreadful accident. When she was certain she would be unable to live through any more silence, he turned to Zeke and asked, "When we blessed this woman, what one thing did you note above all other things?" Zeke stepped forward. Against the beautiful green, purple, and gold of his robes, the black sash was stark, punctuating his role. He looked from his uncle to his brother and father before his focus turned to Lilane. "You never once spoke her name. You merely referred to her in different ways descriptively. I remember thinking at the time that it was extraordinary. I have never once heard a blessing that did not, as a central element, include the name of the recipient. I recall your instruction on this matter. You made it clear to me that every blessing, large and small, had several elements that were critical. The first on the list was the recipient's name. The blessing did, however, have all the weight of being direct from deity. The power that permeated each word was more than I have ever felt. I would swear every word was inspired, and know, therefore, that the lack of name had to be a part of that inspiration. You did not forget to use her name." To have Theo giving what appeared to be a lesson in theology in the middle of the night seemed incongruous. Judging by the expression on the face of the king, he was equally puzzled. "Tell me, Zeke," Theo said, "why was her name not included?" His eyes widened and he looked at Lilane in shocked disbelief, before looking at his uncle and blurting out, "Because her name is not Taryn Lilane." She felt as if her future, so brilliant and beautiful 10 minutes ago, shattered in that one moment. With Isaiah still standing behind her, holding her, she had no idea what she would see on his face if she turned around and looked at him. Theo had a faint smile on his face as he looked at Zeke. "I believe you were gifted with a deeper spiritual connection and perception than I was ever granted. When it is time to pass on the keeping of the soul of Estolia, you will guard her well." He turned and looked at her and said, "Your name." In a nation with no divorce, she knew she was lightly unacceptable. "I was born Lily Elaine Tirana. Lilane to my closest friends." If she was going to lose her heart, lose the man who still held her tightly, she did not care about keeping the secret, did not care that she was opening herself up to those who would silence her permanently. "Your age?" Theo asked. 24, was her rapid response. "You have never been to Alaska," Theo asserted. His eyes rose to Isaiah's. "Your soul is in her keeping? You have no doubts?" Isaiah's arms were warm around her, pulling her closer. Orlando Maximiliano was most eloquent in his description of that moment, putting his words in the language of his beautiful bride from England.
When with my body to her wed, the exquisite pleasure of that virgin marriage bed, could none compare the stark cessation of my soul's departure with that sweet sensation of coming home? No, nor can I, for words are weak when used to explain this indelible link. What agony of mind swept o'er me in that time, twixt yielding soul and consent. Ne'er more will I wonder, ne'er more doubt divinity, when with the soaring of my soul, the searing of my heart, I yielded up my soul to her, and safe, she took it in her keeping.
She was pure, and as I took her purity, she took my soul as recompense. Isaiah's final words were poetic. Lilane was touched by both the beauty of the words Isaiah quoted from memory and the throbbing intensity of his emotions. She could not doubt that he had fallen in love with her. Chapter 16. Witness. In the history of most religions there are some dark marks, some smears on the pristine landscape of past events that, if examined closely, show the faith or belief system to be flawed, encompassing the same darkness as the human psyche often wears. From the Inquisition, to the plagues of Egypt, witch burning in America, or less noble events in the myriad other faiths around the globe, all religion seems to have a common theme of hideous actions done in the name of deity. In Estolia, One might argue that it is free of any such deficiencies. But it must be recognized that Estolia, like all other faiths, is administered by flawed men who often act in a way they feel is justified, even when later historians disagree. Meredith Zaccarian, History of Estolia. Randolph Smythe is dead, Theo stated. Aside from Lillian, everyone else in the room looked baffled by his statement. To Lillian it was as welcome a message as any she could imagine, though if Isaiah was not holding her, she would have crumpled to the floor at that amazing pronouncement. "Who is Randolph Smythe?" Isaiah asked predictably. She pulled away from him and turned so she could see his face. She owed him the truth. Her eyes met his as she stated, "My husband." He stepped backward and looked at her in shock. Zeke stepped forward and said, with authority, "Your soul is in her keeping, Isaiah, married or not, she came to you pure. She is also free to knit her life to yours." The king, who had remained silent throughout the entire drama, asked, "Why did you come here as Taryn Lillian?" She was terrified they would now send her away, that her actions would result in harm coming to Isaiah. She wished desperately that his arms were still around her. Randolph wanted an ornament, not a wife. "My family," her words were bitter, "sold me to him when I was 14. She looked away from the three men and her thoughts returned to the day she was participating in a car wash for the local high school. The luxury vehicle pulled into the car wash and the man inside offered a staggering sum to the teenage car washers to clean the already immaculate vehicle. Stuart, Randolph's flunky, climbed out, and within minutes he gathered the necessary information. Lillian, washing the windows in a damp bare midriff top, was oblivious to Randolph's interest. 3 days later Stuart showed up at the trailer park where she lived. The aging structure was ill-equipped to house the 7 children and 5 adults who called it home. The money Stuart offered her father, Harold Tirana, was enough to overcome any scruples he might have had at the request, to give permission for Randolph Smythe to marry his 14-year-old daughter. Her father accepted the bribe, and 2 days later, baffled and drugged into compliance, she was exchanging vows with the large blustery man who saw her and wanted to possess her. By the end of the day, she was in New York, learning what she would need to do to successfully decorate Randolph Smythe's arm. The prize virgin he might, someday, choose to possess. Like some glorified mannequin, he made sure she was dressed in the finest clothing, coiffed and polished to look exquisite. For 8 years she lived under the threat of his eventual possession. Within a few hours she learned to put on an act of docile stupidity. Stuart tutored her in every nuance of her behavior so that she did not disappoint Randolph. She was extremely intelligent and learned quickly, and he came to believe in her basic stupidity. He kept her with him always, wanting the men he dealt with to be lusting after his wife while they closed business deals worth millions. When men from some government agency bustled her into a black van, she went with them willingly, answering their questions in exacting detail. With no outlet for her mind, she had spent her time paying close attention to everything he did. Her expression was bleak when she answered the king's query, "I gave evidence against Randolph, and they gave me a new identity. They were certain he'd try to have me killed." Randolph Smythe, Theo said, was arrested. Apparently, he found it amusing that the ornamental wife who decorated his home for 8 years turned against him. He, in turn, secured his freedom by providing information that would imprison many men. He refused protective custody, and was shot and killed 12 hours after his release. His last words were, "Elaine will probably never know how deeply she affected me. The sweet purity of her spirit reformed me. You are now a very wealthy woman." Lillian knew what she wanted out of life, and it was the man looking at her with great solemnity. "None of the wealth of the world matters to me. The only thing that matters is Isaiah." Theo stepped forward and rested his hand gently over her abdomen and closed his eyes briefly. When his eyes opened, he looked at his nephew and said, "Isaiah Monterey Zaccarian, as heir to the throne of Estolia, your burdens are great, your freedoms few. Having given your soul into the keeping of Lily Elaine Tirana, your union will be blessed with a son, born in the waning moments of this year." He looked at Zeke. Lazarus Ezekiel Zaccarian, are you prepared to exercise the duties of last resort if your brother, the future king, rejects his Kaylee? Zeke's jaw clenched, a muscle jerking along his jaw. His voice was clear and sure as he said, I am prepared to fulfill my role as last resort if my brother, the future king, chooses to reject his Kaylee. Isaiah looked into Lilaine's eyes. She possessed his soul. No man could understand what that felt like until it took place. He never felt the burden of his role or religion, as he did in that moment. Having consummated their union, abdication was not enough. If he could not accept her, his brother would be forced into the one act of barbarism that was part of the religion. Only twice, in 88 generations, was the last resort called on to exercise his duty. If Isaiah rejected this woman who kept secrets, who believed herself married to another when she gave herself to him, then his brother would be forced to take first her life, and the son she was conceiving, and then Isaiah's. His eyes locked onto hers, and he felt the weight of this decision. He wouldn't be able to choose her merely to spare her life, nor to spare his own. He couldn't choose her just because she kept not only his soul but his heart as well. He couldn't even choose her to spare his brother the most heinous of duties. He had to choose based on what was right for Estolia. His brother was gripping the ceremonial dagger strapped to the inner surface of the sash of office. The only way Isaiah could accept this woman was if it was right for his nation, for his lineage, and for himself. The sordid tale of her life made him doubt her suitability as queen. His decision felt inevitable and he closed his eyes. He took a deep breath and prepared to make the most difficult, and the final decision of his life. His uncle's soft voice stopped him. Consider the blessing. Isaiah closed his mouth and opened his eyes. Zeke's hands were clasped and his uncle, in this moment never truer as keeper of the soul of Estolia, was urging his memory to take in the words of the blessing he heard shortly before the sun set on Estolia only hours ago. The blessing his brother proclaimed was inspired by deity. He recalled the critical part of the blessing.
This worthy daughter of Estolia will be remembered among the greatest of all our queens. The blessings of deity upon her and her posterity are as bright as the aura that confirms each Kaylee, as bright as her fiery hair. She will try the faith of many in the crucible of their inner convictions and strengthen their faith through that trial by fire. Deity commands that all who hear or read this blessing remember, above other considerations, that this daughter of Estolia is worthy of this future. She is worthy of the soul that will come into her keeping.
There was more to the blessing, but the part he needed to remember came back to him. The three words kept echoing round in his head. She is worthy, he reiterated, pulling her up tight against his body. He now understood why married couples frequently touched. His body yearned after his soul, but he could only have it when they were in contact and in accord. He would never be complete so long as he was separate from this woman. They would be together until time and age pulled one to the grave, swiftly followed by the other. Having made his choice, he remembered his brother's blessing. It was as powerful as Lilaine's, proclaiming him to be one who, as keeper, would have visions of equivalent power to those received by Zaccarias. If Isaiah had demanded that Zeke exercise his role as last resort, and become the new heir apparent, that would have nullified the blessing he received less than 6 hours ago. He closed his eyes and soaked up the warmth and presence of the woman who now kept his soul, and thanked deity for the blessings given with such abundance to the sons of Zaccarias. Chapter 17. Cassiopeia. History demonstrates that the human condition is such that people will conform within the constraints of any societal construct given appropriate incentives. Atrocities have been carried out by some of the gentlest of individuals if those actions are sanctioned and required by the framework of their society. Likewise, men and women have been known to perform great feats of self-sacrifice when their society places a value upon those actions. Thus, I am frequently awed at what was created here in Estolia. With freedom to create whatever they wanted the nation to be, the result was, perhaps, the greatest that mankind could ever achieve. Lazarus Ricardan Zaccarian, Capitulo 84. Zeke pulled another robe out of the chest at the foot of the bed and handed it to Lilane. "Come," he said to both of them, "our obligations are not yet at an end." She shrugged into the robe. Isaiah looked troubled, grim. When his eyes met hers, his features transformed into a reassuring smile. He extended a hand to her, and they followed the three other men. Her first impression of Zeke was that he was a pale duplicate of his older brother, Isaiah. In the 4 days since she met him, he had changed, matured, grown into his own identity. Particularly after the strange exchange in Isaiah's bedroom. When they reached Cassie's room, they knocked once before entering. Morgan was in bed with Cassie. The king said, "Monsieur Luc Dumaine, would you care to explain yourself?" Morgan smiled at Cassie before saying, "Cassie tells me she has captured my soul and we are bound for all eternity together." Theo responded, his words clothed in steel. "She cannot capture your soul. But she can keep it for you if you give it to her. The one thing she cannot do, Morgan Luc Dumaine, once you give your soul into her keeping, is give it back." Morgan did not look at all disturbed. "I do not want it back. I knew if I touched her, I would be tied to her for all eternity." He smiled fondly at the woman in bed with him. The king spoke again, "I cannot countenance my daughter leaving Estolia. Many do leave, to keep the island from overpopulation. But she must remain." Morgan looked up and said, "When I was a child, my great-aunt Harmony visited Illy several times. She very quickly became my favorite relative. She told me she lived in Estolia, a magical land where she fell in love and was living happily ever after. I was enthralled with her story. I wanted to go to Estolia, find love, and live happily ever after too. 8 months ago, I turned 30, and the desire to visit my great-aunt became overpowering, until finally I had to act on it. I wish to remain here forever with Cassie and embrace the Estolian faith." The clock chimed the hour. Theo suggested, "We will bring the 4 of you to the temple, and in 7 days we will hold a double ceremony." Leo smiled at his oldest son and then at his daughter. "Your brother has placed his soul in the keeping of your friend Lilane." Cassie smiled brightly at her brother, extending one hand to him. "The blessings of Zaccarias come thickest to those who honor his vision most completely," she quoted. "I am honored, Morgan, and I will be able to share in the blessings of your union." "Come," Theo said to the other men, "there is much to prepare. We wish to celebrate in less than 6 hours." Within 5 minutes she was alone in Cassie's room. Cassie patted the bed at her side. Lilane removed the robe and climbed into the bed with her best friend. "I knew you would not be returning to the United States. Eduardo has a very special perception. Did you think I would marry your brother?" Cassie nodded. "Eduardo was specific that Isaiah should be the one to instruct you on the Estolian people and faith. Uncle Theo had concerns about you, but his blessing was everything any woman would want. He said multiple times throughout that you were worthy of the honor." "Your brother almost rejected me," Lilane revealed. Cassie sat up, a look of horror on her face. "Before or after you took his soul?" She lost the color in her cheeks in distress. "After. Your uncle Theo asked if Zeke was willing to exercise his duty as last resort if your brother rejected me." She felt a shiver of remembered fear as she recounted, "I think he was going to reject me until Theo reminded him of the blessing." Tears began to trace their way down Cassie's cheeks. "What is it?" Lilane asked. "When the promise of Zaccarias was recorded, the future of our nation was linked to the willingness of the heir to fulfill his part of the bargain." She looked away as she admitted, "The requirement is that each heir to the throne should find his Kaylee in his 30th year, place his soul in her keeping, and wed her within 7 days. If he rejects her, does not marry her, our entire nation will crumble and become nothing. For 2,700 years this promise has been fulfilled. Only twice has the last resort been called upon to do what is necessary to ensure the heir to the throne would always wed his Kaylee." She shook her head at the images visible only to her mind. Then if he rejected me, he would not keep this promise of Zaccarias. The last resort could not let that happen. Realization swept through her. Isaiah could not marry me if he was dead. Nor could you marry him if you were also dead. It is the most brutal aspect of our faith. Twice in our history, in over 88 generations, has the last resort been called on by duty to our nation to fulfill his obligation and kill his own brother. Your Uncle Theo saved my life. Yes, he is a very wise man. Cassie cocked her head to one side to ask, why would my brother reject you? He was taken with you the moment he met you. He found out I have already been married. Extraordinary, and yet you keep his soul. Did your husband die prior to the consummation of your marriage? No, I didn't even know he was dead. I do not think I would have come here if I understood the implications. However, he died 2 days after I was placed in witness protection. That is why you did not know my name. Instead of Taryn Lilane, my real name is Lily Elaine Tirana, but I prefer to go by Lilane. I like your name, it is beautiful. What will happen tomorrow? Lilane asked. Cassie's smile grew wide, her bubbly nature reasserting itself. We shall travel to the temple. Once a man of Estolia gives his soul into the keeping of his Kaylee, they must spend 7 days in seclusion. After 7 days, we will have a ceremony and become tied together until time itself ceases to be. It seems to me that in Estolia things are sort of backwards when compared to the rest of the world. To wed someone here, it begins with intimacy, followed by a honeymoon of sorts, and then finally the actual wedding. Cassie's laugh was musical. Oh, Lilane, you and I will be the best of friends. Consider, to an Estolian it is inconceivable to marry someone who has not already shared intimacy with them. The rest of the world does things most backwards compared with the logical way it happens here in Estolia. Chapter 18. Coronation. One day I was sitting with my wife while she nursed our beautiful daughter, Rhiannon, when Leon burst into our sitting room, holding back tears and obviously distressed. I asked him what was disturbing him. Gerard, he mentioned one of his friends, told me I was the only Estolian who does not get to choose my own Kaylee. Is that true? That was one of those moments I did not anticipate, though I should have. How do you tell your son that the happiness of an entire nation is dependent on his willingness to fulfill the promise of Zaccarias? Isaiah Monterey Zaccarian, Capitulo 88.
January 7th, 1990, Lily Elaine Zaccarian. I, Theobald Reginald Zaccarian, 87th Keeper. Confer upon you the title of Queen of Estolia, 88th after Estoliana, Kaylee of the King, Isaiah Monterey Zaccarian, and mother of the heir apparent, Leonidas Agamemnon Zaccarian. You enrich Estolia with the strength of your character and the unique qualities of the progeny you will bear. I urge you to place the needs of Estolia over the needs of self. Always remember that unto those who are given tremendous burdens are also given great blessings. As queen, your life is wholly given over to the citizens, and you will find great peace and joy in your role. All these blessings and many more I bestow upon you on this beautiful morning, fully within the light and sight of deity.
When Theo finished, he settled a crown upon her head. Isaiah urged her to her feet with a hand at her elbow. She looked into his dear face, the peace and happiness filling her heart, mind and soul was greater than any one person had the right to experience. When Isaiah cupped her face gently, she could sense that they were in accord. He was wearing his father's crown. Together they turned to Zeke, who was holding their son in his arms. He handed the baby over to Isaiah and then stepped off the dais. Isaiah settled their son in her arms carefully, and then put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close against his side. They turned together to face the gathered citizens. Peace suffused her body, self, and soul. They would be together forever, fulfilling their place in Estolia. She would have 2 more sons and maybe even a daughter. Most important of all, she would have this man by her side, always. Eduardo could feel tears running down his face as he watched the ceremony. Lillian had worried him. She was so earnest, so dedicated to getting a good grade and doing the assignment right. But she had seemed somehow hunted. He had some reservations about sending her to meet Isaiah, but at the thought of not sending her, he felt a looming sense of foreboding. She belonged there, with Isaiah. To judge by the happiness and love radiating from both of them, he made the correct decision. Once the couple were out of seclusion, Theo sent him a long letter, sharing with him the important aspects of her story. The sounds of the ceremony grew muted and Eduardo frowned as it occurred to him that he had made no plans to travel to Estolia to witness the coronation. He glanced around, noticing that only one person in the room was visible with crystal clarity. Anastasia. "I was always destined to keep your soul, Eduardo," she said. "But can you still, my love?" he asked her, remembering the sharp agony of loss when she died. He should not be in Estolia watching the birth blessing for the heir apparent, and the coronation of the newest king. She closed the distance between them, her touch bringing him pleasure and a joy out of all proportion to the occasion. As if the happiness of an entire lifetime was condensed into that one touch. He must have died and gone to heaven, or he was having the most realistic and fulfilling dream of his life. Your body has failed you. This is Horizon, my love. I have waited for you, watched you, been with you all these years. We will now be together forever.